Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you. Hopefully, we're kind of gathering now. I know a number of you are going to be gathering on YouTube. Some of you, particularly from St. Diana's Church, are here with me on Zoom over the next hour or so. And hopefully, I've got a setup here that works. But it's great to have you. If you've just joined us or if you're joining us right now, it's great to have you with us. I know there's a few home groups around the place who are wanting to connect tonight. So whichever church you belong to, obviously super welcome. If you're here just exploring and you've just stumbled across this evening, I'll explain a bit more in just a moment. If you're part of St. D's, hopefully you'll find this evening helpful. I hope you're all doing okay. It's a funny old time, isn't it? I was chatting just this week about how we're sort of obviously hearing now a little bit more difficult news, but this unlock, the need to almost celebrate unlocking, but actually feeling a level of nervousness around unlocking it's been quite a difficult thing to understand for many people. The first lockdown was obviously very difficult, but unlocking is difficult in new ways, and life has changed. One of the things we're trying to address here is how can I find my equilibrium? How can I find my balance, if you like, in a changed world? And so tonight we're going to be beginning to address some of those issues. Just a kind of outline, I guess, if you've not met me before, I'm Will Vanderhart, and I'm an Anglican priest in London. I have been for the last 17 years. I work now as Associate Vicar at St. Diana's St. Parsons Green, who are hosting tonight. And I work with my colleagues, Dr. Chichi O'Boyer, Dr. Rob Waller, and Dr. Kate Middleton in the Minor Soul Foundation. And if you're looking for additional resources around mental and emotional health tonight, then you can head over to our site, minorsoulfoundation.org, or any of our social channels at Minor Soul UK. And so hopefully we are going to kind of head into content in just a minute. We're going to hang straight into content. Let me just say a bit about what you need tonight for engagement. I guess those of you who are working together as a home group, hopefully there'll be some things that you'll be able to pull out into conversation a little later on. A notebook might be handy, just to make a few points. I've got slides to share, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the slide packs available at the Minor Soul resources page, just as a PDF. So if you don't quite get everything off of the slides in time, then don't worry about it. Just head over to the Minor Soul site. I'll make sure they're up by the end of play over the weekend. So head back in, and then we're back on the following 2 Thursdays. So next Thursday and the Thursday after, looking in more detail at some of the issues we're raising tonight. So hopefully that will set you up well. And the kind of pitch we're looking at tonight is for every person. So if you're a psychologist watching this, hopefully there'll be an awful lot of things here that you know very, very well already. If you're a complete layperson, hopefully there's some things you don't know so well. But this is really sort of entry point discussion around our emotional health, and particularly finding states of emotional balance. Well, why don't we get into some content, and just invite you to sort of take a breath and just sort of relax into this. The point is not that there's some sort of flashy event, but it's that you just maybe are given a few helpful tools and ideas around how you're doing at the moment and how you can increase your well-being. And I guess one of the first things to address is this idea of emotional balance. Lots of us think that as far as the emotions are concerned, we're just victims of fortune, or that actually our lives are extremely private and there's no way that we're going to let anyone in to help. So one of the key things here, especially if you're gathering as a group, is to say, actually, you can help one another with your emotions, and our collective experience is really, really important for balance. Finding that sort of honest, supportive and compassionate voice in our life to say, actually, how can I help you? How can I support you? Are things in balance? And one of the great challenges around problems, around a sense of vulnerability, is that we feel unworthy, and then we're likely to shut down the conversation. And I think that's a key challenge for many of us, is actually, how can I be open to the conversation around being helped? This is a survey around from the National Survey for Mental Health and Wellbeing. It suggested actually that 38% of people said that they prefer to manage problems themselves. 18% said they didn't believe anything could help them. 17% didn't know where they could get any help. And 14% said they're worried about what others would think about them needing any help. And I would say, actually, that final figure looks incredibly low to me. Many of us are saying, please stop trying to help me, because we're worried really about being vulnerable. But I guess, in opening, I really want to encourage you to say that getting help, getting support is absolutely fundamental here. Living honestly and openly. If we're going to find balance in life, it's rarely because we've already perceived the need for balance. It's often when others are pointing out imbalance in our lives that we can begin to get things sorted and get things organized or appraise our experience. I just want you to just a brief exercise, just for 30 seconds. I'm going to be really quiet. I just want to encourage you to think about your life and just to measure it, if you like, between demands and resources. So what's in your out tray, what's going out, and like what's coming in, what's a fuel and what's an output. So what are the demands you're facing right now, and what are the resources, what's really feeding you? So just take 30 seconds right now, I've got it on my clock, just to think about what this might look like for you. What are the demands you're facing, and what are the resources you're receiving? Let's just take a moment to think about this, and we'll come back together just in 30 seconds. Okay, I hope that went okay for you. Many of us will have felt a little overwhelmed at the end of that 30 seconds because we're confronted by a significant amount of demands. And many of us will be thinking, actually, I don't feel that there are very many resources in my life right now. I don't think there are many things that are feeding me or filling me. And I feel like my emotional tank is empty. One of the challenges, again, we face is wanting to just strive on, to be positive. Many of us always saying things like, well, other people are worse off than I am, or I've got nothing really to complain about. And that may be true comparatively, but we don't live our emotions in a comparative way. We experience them. And therefore, if you have lots of blessings in your life, there are lots of benefits in your life, it doesn't mean that you're not going to feel emotionally overwhelmed or out of balance, because you actually have emotional demands, and you cannot be comparative with your emotions. So I want to encourage you tonight just to own your emotions. Emotions aren't either good or bad, they just are. I always describe them as a bit like taking the temperature of a pool. If you put the thermometer in, it might be hot, it might be cold, it might be lukewarm, but you can't be angry with a thermometer. It's just explaining, or it's expressing your experience of a particular moment. And however you've experienced the last 18 months is like to have been pretty painful. Your reactions, your responses to the last 18 months are real, they're true, they're not better or worse than anyone else's, they just are yours. And therefore we've got to learn, if you like, how we can find new balance in this changing world. Well, I want to spend a little bit of time tonight, well, the predominance of tonight, thinking about our physiological and psychological responses to stress. And I really didn't do well in physics when I was at school, but I think one of the things that I learned, the only thing probably that I took away from physics, was this idea of what's called Hooke's law. And this is the idea that you could measure the load on an object before it returns to its original shape. And the challenge was that could you measure the point at which a spring, which seemed to be the lifeblood of physics, would no longer return to its original shape? And I'm thinking a lot about this idea about the autonomic nervous system. So this is the word that we use to describe, if you like, our nervous system, the one that organizes us in response to stress and also to stress recovery. And when we think about stress, many of us will be thinking about sort of boom or bust. I'm either working hard or I'm relaxing on a beach. But stress isn't just about having no load or a full load. It's about recognizing that a load on our shoulders is a good thing. That actually no one lives their lives either with sort of boom or bust mentality. The holiday might be good, it has its own stresses, but it doesn't resolve all of your problems. And actually being underloaded is actually quite difficult. If you've ever spent time with someone who's lost their job and has been unemployed or underemployed, it's actually a very stressful circumstance to be in. Humans do really well with a level of productive stress. If you look at the springs on the left-hand side of this image, you'll see that they're only coils of metal, but they become life-filled, they become energy-filled when you compress them. So a piece of load, or when you extend them, some load, some extension is a good thing, and our nervous system is developed to manage stress. So a level of stress, if you like, is a good thing, and we thrive with a certain level of stress, productive stress. What happens, though, when we are overloaded for a significant amount of time? And that means that our capacity to return to normal is diminished. And ultimately, if we stay under extended load, we become destructively strained, and then we begin to bend out of shape. And our autonomic nervous system is designed, if you like, to fluctuate, to work rapidly through cycles of overload and normal load and sometimes underload. But what it doesn't really do so well with is extended pressure. And what we've experienced in the pandemic has been high levels of stress for a significant amount of time. And for many of us, that will have felt like destructive strain. I've described it as if you're like, plugged into an adrenal drip for a year. There's always this underlying sense of anxiety. And as that begins to lift through the vaccines and the kind of changing numbers with COVID, we find ourselves not just automatically recovering, but need to actually address the emotional exhaustion that we have felt over the years that's passed. And a lot of the anxiety that comes about for us in this is actually just a lack of understanding around the simple ways in which our nervous systems work. So I want to help you tonight with a few of the basics, and we're going to explore what it looks like to kind of, if you like, unload and then rebalance. And I'm going to be offering you a few tools towards the end of this evening session, and then some more tools through the next two sessions. Let's have a think about our autonomic nervous system. Again, I like foxes. I'm a big fan of Charlie Maxey's book, and I've got a couple of foxes here to show you. We're describing the autonomic nervous system and the two nervous systems that make up the autonomic nervous system. The first one is the sympathetic, and the second one is the parasympathetic. And the sympathetic nervous system is the one that's responsible for, if you like, our activity, particularly in response to stress and danger. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the one that's responsible for our rest and recovery. And these two nervous systems are essential to our well-being because effectively they work in balance, they work in tandem with one another to help us to both appropriately extend and appropriately recover. And many people talk about the nervous system. They say, I'm having a nervous breakdown, or my nerves are shot. And often nearly always they're talking about their sympathetic nervous system. And many people aren't actually aware of the fact that they've got a second nervous system which can be stimulated practically, psychologically, and can actually elicit greater levels of rest. And this is, if you like, one of the key learnings from tonight's session, is that God has designed us, I believe, to live in balance, and that the balance is almost created inside of us. It's coded inside of us between these two different forces, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And I want to sort of engage a little bit more into these, but if we're going to talk a little bit more about the sympathetic to start with, that's the one we deem as being responsible for the fight or flight mechanism, which you will have heard about, you'll hear more about tonight. And the parasympathetic nervous system is in charge of what we call the rest and digest quota of our lives. So think about these two elements of our nervous system in balance: fight and flight, and then rest and digest. hopefully that is a helpful parallel as we move on. Now, how are you feeling again? Let me give you just another 30 seconds right now, just to think about your relationship between those two different parts of the autonomic nervous system. We encourage you just to take a breath. Now, I use a little breathing technique quite often called the 7-11. I would breathe in through the nose for 7, out through the mouth for 11. And you can use a sort of a mindfulness technique alongside this. I like to sometimes use scripture, a psalm, a verse, word of encouragement, something from nature. But I breathe in, I do 3 cycles, breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth, 7-11, 7-11, 7-11. I'm going to just lead us just as a moment of reflection in this little activity. And then I want you to just allow yourself to focus a little bit on these two nervous systems and ask yourself, as we do this, where are you in balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic? So let's just relax your shoulders, relax your body. If you like, ground your feet flat on the floor, open your hands palm side up and place them on your thighs in front of you. And relax. And breathe in through the nose for 7. And out through the mouth for 11. And in for 7. And out for 11. And in for 7. And out for 11. And relax, breathe normally. If you are looking for balance, I think our breathing system is a really good way of, again, stimulating our parasympathetic nervous system. You can just carry on that little technique whenever you're feeling a little stressed. How did you go in assessing how there was balance in your life at the moment between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems? Again, hopefully some of you are thinking, actually, I feel like I'm doing quite well with the parasympathetic nervous system at the moment. Others of you might not have known it exists, or you might feel that you've actually been in fight or flight mode for a really long time. Let's have a slightly deeper look at what the sympathetic nervous system does. Again, I've got a few foxes to share with you on the screen. And let's just have a little think about the sympathetic response. So whenever we're in a position of threat, we are activated through our nervous system and the sympathetic response flows. And physiologically speaking, there is a huge amount going on. Our bloodstream is filled with adrenaline and cortisol, and we have our small vessels constrict. Blood is drawn towards our heart speeds up and our eyes dilate. We tend to flush, and a lot of physiological changes take place in a really short space of time. And those physiological changes are all about, if you like, preparing a response. And this response is the fight or flight or freeze response. And it really can happen within a quarter of a second. So it's very powerful, it's very overwhelming, and very dominant. And you can see the fox here. He's under attack. The first thing, or the first response, might be initially to fight back. The second response is to run away. The third one might be to freeze. And all of us will have a typical dominant sympathetic response. Some people are more naturally angry in the face of threat. Some people tend to run. Some people just get frozen out and kind of go quiet. But we'll all have a response similar to these responses. And you might know particularly what the dominant one is for you. The key thing here is that the sympathetic response is absolutely essential for living. Let's think about it in natural terms again. Imagine you had a lodge in the woods, and you were having a breakfast, and a bear came in through the door. You can imagine immediately you're in a relaxed state. Immediately, all of these hormones flood through your body. You kind of jump up within seconds. You're immediately scanning the environment for an opportunity to run away. If there doesn't happen to be a back door to your lodge, you might need to think about fighting back. I saw an interesting clip, I think, on the news the other day of a woman who was protecting her dogs from a bear, and she actually went over and sort of pushed the bear away, which was a remarkable thing to do to protect her dogs. In that moment, she wasn't consciously thinking, I'm just about to attack a bear, but her autonomic nervous system had been activated, her sympathetic nervous system had been activated, and then she's fighting back. And afterwards, she can't even remember what's happened because it's almost automatic, it's autonomic. And that's the way that this system works. So it's very, very significant. It's very powerful. It's very natural. It's instinctual, and it's ultimately protective. One of the great challenges that we face is, though, that we're not often fighting bears in the woods. And what tends to happen with emotional stress and pressure is that it elicits the same sort of physiological response as a physical encounter. So you could say a pandemic, for example, has very, very similar emotional reactivity to meeting a bear in a cabin, apart from the fact that the bear in the cabin might last seconds, whereas a pandemic is lasting for years. And that's why we are very much activated in the fight or flight pretty much all the time to a level. And we get this sort of level of emotional exhaustion and emotional burnout. Some people have said to me, Will, why do I just feel so tired all the time? I'm thinking, imagine that system is always running to a level that your heart rate is up slightly, you're not sleeping so well, you're more alert, you're what we call hypervigilant, you're more jumpy, you're more irritable. All these things, if you like, are an outworking of that sympathetic nervous system. Let's think a bit about how it should work effectively. So when it's working well, what really should happen? I've got a couple of slightly more complicated slides to show you now. Hopefully you'll be able to follow them. But as I said, I'll share them on the Mind and Soul site afterwards so you can connect with them. So the whole principle here is that there is an event. I described it as the bear coming into your lodge, but an event, it could be bad news on the news, it might be an illness, or it might be a thought, but there's an event that leads to subsequent thoughts and emotions. And if we lack experience in this area, thoughts and emotions will be very tightly coupled together. So we'll often not be sure which one came first. Did the thought come first, or did the emotion come first? Some people say, "Oh, I just suddenly felt dread," but you don't normally feel dread unless you've perceived something in the environment that makes you feel dread, or even within yourself. So often there's a really strong coupling between the thought and the emotion. Now, the thought emotion in response to the event leads to physical changes, and that brings us to attention. So we will, if you like, feel more physically aware when we're triggered in the sympathetic nervous system. And then there are analytical thoughts which run through that kind of sharpness of thinking. What do I need to do in response to this event, which I filtered through these thoughts and emotions? And that leads us to a decision, either that we need to take action, or we don't need to take action. Interestingly, when the autonomic nervous system is working very well, we flip between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic quite quickly. When action's been taken, or when we know that no action needs to be taken, we will divert round again to the parasympathetic recovery. So we might be dealing with a problem. The problem might create a level of anxiety. We might feel some physical changes. We'll sharpen our thinking around that particular event. Then we'll respond to the event with action or with no action, and then we'll begin a recovery phase. So the balance that we find in the emotions, particularly where stress is concerned, is often that it is a cycle of awareness, analysis, attention, decision, and then recovery. And I'd love you just to take a moment right now whilst I hold up this slide to you to imagine circumstances where you have seen your autonomic nervous system working really effectively. It might be something in recent history, maybe driving your car, you suddenly saw someone break up ahead. You thought in the emotion, a sudden little bit of dread. I thought of, oh my goodness, maybe I'm going to bash into the back of their car. There were physical changes, maybe you physically stiffen. The analytical thought prompted you to press the brake, which you did partly instinctually, but with partial awareness. the decision was a good one. You relaxed, the driver in front of you drove on, you turned up the stereo, you began to feel like a comfortable driver again. Here's a simple example. I'm going to give you 30 seconds just to think through an example of your autonomic nervous system working really well, bouncing between the two aspects of it, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Okay, I want to, I hope that's been helpful, and I hope you've found an illustration. There'll be millions of illustrations of your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system working really well together, because you'll be using those two systems every day. But for many of us, remember that overloaded spring. When we are overloaded and our stress system is really beginning to burn very hot, we become less effective at balancing between those two systems. And we actually find it much, much harder to get rest. As I mentioned earlier, people now coming out of pandemic still struggling, maybe some even beginning to struggle with things they didn't struggle with before. Poor appetite, changes in appetite, sleeplessness, irritability, all these things are sort of sign of an overextended nervous system struggling to relax. And people saying, well, like, I'm not physically unsafe. I'm in my home. I'm in a good environment, and yet I don't feel like I can wind down. I think that's one of the things that I've heard over and over and over again over the last several months. I just can't wind down. And then we might find that things like alcohol begin to play a part in an ability to wind down that can cause other complicated problems. So what's going on here? Well, our ability, if you like, to cycle through to come to a decision is sometimes inhibited. And if you like, we get caught up in the sympathetic nervous system process because we are scanning for threats, not just responding to threats. So what's happening here is that actually we become so vigilant to danger that we see danger everywhere rather than responding to the danger that we perceive. And that sounds like I'm saying exactly the same thing in a slightly different way, but I'm actually not. Unconsciously, when our sympathetic nervous system is working well, it is guarding and guiding us, bringing us awareness of things that we need to respond to. But when we become very conscious of that process, when we become, if you like, wrapped up in an emergency response, we become hyper vigilant. That means we become super seeing to all sorts of potential risks and dangers. And you will have noticed over the course of the pandemic that there'll be some things which have really propagated significant amounts of discomfort in you, which you've then dismissed later. But why on earth was I worrying about that? Why was I troubled about that? Well, let's have a look at an image which sort of describes that process a little bit better. So here's the fox again, and now what you can see is the same event idea. We respond to the event with thoughts and emotions strongly coupled together. And that leads to physical changes, which again propagate a level of anxiety because the physical changes seem to prove that our thoughts and emotions around an event are well placed. And our analytical thoughts, rather than finding us in a resolution between a decision or not a decision, lead to more unhelpful thoughts, propagating more emotion, making us feel more trapped, which lead again to more unhelpful thoughts, which propagate again more emotion. And this time, the thoughts and the emotions are really fueling the physical changes. So we find ourselves to be more stirred up. We find ourselves feeling more on edge, physically more anxious, less able to sleep. And we are really now in the sort of height of the fight, flight, or freeze cycle. So you can see some changes here. And some of you will be feeling a little bit pessimistic now, but please don't, because we're going to be moving into some tools for resolution a little later on. But the key thing to describe here is that the system is not working in balance anymore, because rather than flowing through the sympathetic response to an event into the parasympathetic recovery from the resolution of that event, we are now in a little bit of a vicious circle where we're not getting any new information. If you like, the event is still the event, but the event, in the way which we're processing it, is beginning to drive the energy of more emotion and more pessimism, and that leads to these physical changes. Now, I wonder whether or not you're prone to what we call catastrophization. This is something I'm really good at. There used to be a word association game with a guy called Timmy Mallet that I used to watch when I was a kid, and you'd say one thing like jam, and the next person would say cars, and you were thinking actually about spreadable jam, and then they'd say cars, and you would say lorries, and then they would say traffic lights, and then you'd say ice cream because that was a kind of ice cream. So it was an association game, and everything linked to something else. Where we deal with negative or intrusive, anxiety-provoking thoughts, our minds can often do that same thing. It creates these strong associations and ultimately takes us to the worst possible place. So if you like, this can become very cyclical, not because the event that intruded actually is going to take us to that catastrophe, but because through processing the event, we begin to take ourselves towards a catastrophe of our own imagining. So this is the idea: you wake up in the middle of the night, you hear a bit of a creak. Now you could think, there's a bit of a draft in our house, or it's been a hot day, the floorboards are kind of expanding, which is probably what's been going on. But instead you think there's a burglar in my house. Once you've thought there's a burglar in your house, you feel physical changes. Then you imagine yourself being not just robbed, but beaten by the burglar and kind of left for dead. And before you know it, it's a terminal situation. So key part of the process, if you like, for the sympathetic nervous system, when it gets out of control, is that we're overstimulated and exhausted. We're less able to manage the pressure, and therefore our nervous system is out of balance, and we stay in the sympathetic state rather than beginning to move towards rest. Another way in which this can be worked out, again, this is the final one of these slightly more complex slides, it is actually a more physical response. And for some people and in some circumstances, again, we can almost bypass the thoughts aspect of our fight or flight reaction. So again, I talked earlier about temperament. Some people are more fight, some people are more flight, some people are more freeze. Some people tend to work this out more in their head, other people work it out more in their body. But when there's an event, we filter it again through strong thoughts and emotions. We can immediately fast track towards strong physical changes and then react. So we might actually become violent, or we might run away, or we might shout and, if you like, just express ourselves verbally, but in quite a physical, visceral way. And then the analytical part of our mind is almost playing catch up with the shame of thinking, oh my goodness, I'm completely out of control. Now, I know a lot of people who are great parents, great partners, responsible people, might have felt some of this during the pandemic, very physical. Maybe they broke something, threw something on the ground, slammed doors, and that seemed quite out of character for them. They normally got quite a good grip on themselves, at least physically. But just to encourage you again, that this is part of the fight or flight response. Someone who's very overextended, who's less able to manage the emotion, suddenly finding powerful physical changes that are leading them to take action to try and find relief. So 2 tracks within the sympathetic nervous response, which, if you like, can be less helpful and less resolving. One is the very, very cognitive, that's the thought-based one that leads you stuck in these kind of audio loops of negative thoughts and negative emotions, fueling physical changes. The other one is a very physicalized response, which is very visceral, often quite angry or fearful, and they're both challenging, as I'm sure you guys will all understand. So, a couple of ways in which this stuff is problematic and challenging. Now, as I said earlier, what I hope to do is not to make you feel pessimistic or overly worried, but hopefully a little bit of revelation about the way in which I believe God has created us with these really helpful, really powerful responses to danger, but also an adjunct system to help us begin to rest and recover. And I want to spend just the remainder of this session to think a bit more about how we can make some interruptions, if you like, in the negative cycles of the sympathetic response. But particularly, I want to kind of caveat this by saying, obviously, a lot of this stuff is automatic, but we've got to address some of our beliefs around this. So I just want to give you, again, 30 seconds of a breather. You might want to do the 7-11 breathing technique for just a moment. And I'm going to encourage you then to start thinking about thoughts, beliefs, behaviors, and emotions. So let's just take a breather. I'm just going to put the flat screen on for a second. I'm just going to give you 30 seconds just to have a breather, just have some quiet for a moment, and then we're going to introduce a new idea again. Okay, let's come back in with an idea about how these things propagate. So we're going to go back a step, if you like, into that top line of what actually happens in a relationship between our thoughts, beliefs, behaviors, and emotions. And this is really, really significant because when we looked at that event, at the top there was a strong coupling, I said, for many people between thoughts and emotions. If you like, I've redesigned a slide here with event in the middle. And what I'm going to suggest is if we think about the sympathetic response, it is cycling through these 4 things very powerfully. The event takes place. There are thoughts we have about the event. There are beliefs that we have about ourselves in the context of these events, which didn't appear on earlier slides, and this is very, very important to us tonight. Then there are the emotions which we use to respond to the events that we're experiencing, which are filtered through our thoughts and beliefs. And then there's the, if you like, the physical side or the verbal side, which is the behaviors that flow out of our response. So this is a slightly more integrated view. But what I'm suggesting to you is that the event isn't just objectively received. And this is, if I was going to share one thing with you tonight, it was actually that we're less objective than we think we are. I'm going to go on to some fixed beliefs in a minute, but it's a really key idea that actually there isn't just one way of responding to an event. Let's think about some event that you might have been involved with in the past. Maybe it was something adventurous or something challenging. I took the children to a fairground recently. They have sort of different responses to a ride. Some of them smiling, going on this little roller coaster thing, screaming with laughter, and another one sitting next to them screaming in terror. So same event, very different thoughts about them. One child sitting there thinking this is really fun, another child sitting there thinking this is really unsafe. Same event, but different thoughts. Maybe different beliefs about the roller coaster. One child thinking, wow, I believe this is a really well-made roller coaster and it looks really, really safe. The other child may be thinking, I don't believe this roller coaster is particularly well built. And of course, filtered through those beliefs, those thoughts become quite powerful. And then you have an emotional outworking. So one child laughing, one child screaming. And obviously, in terms of behavior, slightly limited there, but one child might be raising their hands in joy, and one child might be waving a hand in horror, saying, help me, get off. So the key thing to understand is that we can experience exactly the same event, but because of the thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and behaviors we have related to that event, it's very different. Primarily, the thoughts and beliefs we have will determine our emotions and our behaviors. Now, what's so significant is that thoughts and emotions are not absolutely synchronized. That it's not thoughts and emotions, it's thoughts then emotions. And that uncoupling those two and beginning to question what beliefs we might hold can have a really powerful effect on how quickly and how negatively we cycle through the sympathetic response. Lots of people was asking, well, how do you know this? And actually, it's different for me. And I understand all of that. I've sort of shared my story probably too many times, but I was caught up in the London bombings in 2005, and I started having significant panic attacks about 3 months after the event, and had a full-on anxiety breakdown. And what I can tell you is that little events, subsequent events, like, I don't know, a car driving over a Coke can in the street and hearing a kind of bang, or I don't know, anything. Someone calling out my name in the street to say hi would trigger a very, very powerful experience of a thought and an emotion, very, very, very integrated. And then I'd go straight into very, very anxious emotion and physical behaviors like kind of running away, running home, kind of covering my ears, all that sort of stuff, and having panic attacks. So initially, I remember thinking, well, there's no way that you can interrupt the system. It's just happening. And I think that was very, very detrimental to me, because it increased my feelings of powerlessness and therefore reinforced negative beliefs I already experienced. And it was actually a really dear psychologist friend, Vanessa Rospoli, and my dear friend, Dr. Rob Waller, who helped me to realize that there was a gap between my thoughts and my emotions. And so we're going to explore that gap in a minute. But before I do, I want to just challenge a few of the beliefs we have, because the beliefs component is often unseen, and I believe is very, very significant in separating the two. So we can have different sorts of beliefs. Sorry, this slide maybe is a little bit too, oh no, it's not too big. There we go. So we can have, I suggest, 3 different sorts of beliefs which are very kind of centrally incorporated into these responses. The first one is the sort of reactive belief. I have no control over my feelings. So it's kind of a belief that I carry. And so long as I believe that, I'm often going to be victim to this sort of cycle, if you like, of the sympathetic nervous system. Then there's the conditional belief. External circumstances must change for me to feel better inside. So this is the belief that actually things could be different, but they can only really be different if my external circumstances are improved. And obviously, that's okay if they do improve, but during a pandemic, they haven't improved particularly, and therefore we find ourselves in the same sort of emotional state. And then the third one is the intolerant belief, which is that I cannot tolerate painful emotions, which again, ironically, propagates more painful emotion. So a key tool, if you like, because we're going to be unpicking some of these, some of the linkage in the sympathetic cycle. A key element of this is what we actually believe. And as a Christian, I'd say I have to constantly check myself and say, well, look, there are things that I believe in the human which are very limiting, but there's things I believe about God which are very freeing. And there are things that I know God wants me to believe more, to have what we call faith for, and those things are transformative. And we're going to have a look at a few of those at the end of this session. But what I want to encourage you, if you're someone who's on this call who haven't got a faith, what I'd say to you is that, a key tenet of my faith is knowing actually that I'm not just victim of circumstance, actually more than conqueror, and actually that there's God has power in my life, because he also shares my identity. He holds part of my identity in his hands. He says, if you like, who I am. So I might say, I'm unable to tolerate negative feelings, but actually I know that's not true. Or actually I don't necessarily need my external circumstances to change, to feel differently in my circumstances. I'll explain a little bit more about that slightly later on. But for all of us, there comes a moment when we need to explore our I beliefs, because our I beliefs strongly implicate us in the development of our reaction to negative or difficult events. So the thought filtered through the belief increases or amplifies the emotion. And you can understand why this is the case. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Let's go back one step. I'm just going to give you another 30 seconds just to have a look at the slide around the 4 corners, and just to think about how these 4 important elements relate in your emotional balance? Okay, I want you to hold on to the idea of the four corners and around the beliefs. We'll return to the beliefs in just a moment. And I'm going to introduce now. Obviously, we've got sort of 15 minutes of this little webinar left, but I'll introduce you the idea now that that you don't have to automatically transition to negative emotions around a particular event. And this is a really important tool, and I think one which we can really work to develop. And it's the idea of appraisals. And again, in my personal recovery and in the work I've done over the years coaching and working with Mind & Soul Foundation, I've tried to help people really engage with this idea that our thoughts tend to flow into relatively automatic patterns. Remember, the autonomic nervous system is very, very expedient, it's very, very efficient, and it rolls from thought to action in a matter of seconds. The reality is that we often tend to catastrophize. Why? Well, because actually catastrophization makes biological sense. If you assume the worst, if the best happens, nothing bad has happened. But if you assume the best and the worst happens, then you're unprepared and the worst might actually happen. So you could say it's more effective, more efficient to always have a bias towards the negative, to always presume that the worst is going to happen. And where our thoughts are concerned, you can see this large arrow, what I always think. This is the sort of superhighway thought. So imagine your brain right now. If we could map its neural pathways, your brain would be like the map of the UK just using the motorways. So these are the thoughts that we always think. So it's like the M4 between London and Bristol. I'm always driving down this road. Or it's the M6 between, I don't know, Coventry and Birmingham. Is that the right road? It's probably not. But whatever the road is, it's what you always think. And for some of us, it will always be thinking, oh, it's probably the worst is going to happen. I'm going to get ill, or this person doesn't like me, or whatever it is. But we'll always, if you like, have a particular way of working, which we always end up in the destination adrenal zone. But our thoughts aren't dictated to us. They become habitual. And we have the opportunity to make appraisals. And these smaller arrows at the top are new thoughts that I could try, new thoughts I can think. Now, what's really interesting about this is people say, well, there's no way I can sort of make new thoughts up. But actually, you can make new thoughts up. The key thing is you can't necessarily make up new thoughts that you believe, but you can make up new thoughts. So when a difficult circumstance comes in, we can begin to address that difficult circumstance by accepting, yes, my first thought is this burglar is going to kill me, but my new thought is maybe it's the wind, or my third thought might be maybe it's the floorboards cooling after a hot day, or maybe the fourth thought is maybe I just imagined it, I need to just go back to sleep. They're all reasonable thoughts, and our first thought isn't always our best thought. Let's think about some typical thought patterns, if you like, the ones that we always find ourselves rolling down. All or nothing thinking. If this date isn't successful, I'll be single forever. Overgeneralizing. I've been bad at every single job I've done. Personalizing. This is all my fault. Mind reading. All my friends and family think I'm stupid. Jumping to conclusions. My boss doesn't look happy. She must be about to fire me. Catastrophizing. It's going to be a terrible day. Disqualifying the positive. They said something nice to me because they must not mean it. Should, must, or ought. I should be a better. I must start. I ought to have. Da da da. So think about those. It's a really helpful patterns there. I think I got that from the Harvard site. So some really helpful ideas there around the thoughts that we always have. And I guess today what I want to do is encourage you to find balance by being a bit more curious about the first thought and offering ourselves these new appraised thoughts, these other opportunities to think. So when an event happens, you might use something from within the pandemic. rather than making a negative first thought, which is your final thought, be curious about the first thought and then begin to introduce other thoughts. This is like taking the map of England, seeing all the main roads, the M roads, and then superimposing all the A roads on top, and then maybe the B roads, and then even the cart tracks. It becomes a much, much more delicate and interesting map, but also gives your brain the opportunity to choose some new pathways. We know that making new appraisals can affect your mood, but also changes the way in which your brain works. So are we always needing to be slave to a dysfunctional sympathetic nervous system, and we always get locked into the same negative thoughts, stewing within us and then driving negative physical responses? No, we can use appraisal making to begin to change that circumstance. Just to reinforce the point about beliefs, just have a look at this slide here, because I've said already, the negative beliefs that we have, they tend to amplify our emotions. So imagine we had the negative thought, actually, I'm definitely going to have a very, very bad reaction to the COVID vaccine. My emotion might be, oh no, I know it's going to be me, and I'm feeling a terrible amount of dread about it. Our belief in the middle could be the world is dangerous, or actually something is wrong with me, or actually I deserve better than this, and I'll always be the person who's the one in 100 or 1 in 1,000 or whatever it is. So the negative belief amplifies the thought. The thought was, oh my goodness, I'm nervous about having this vaccine. The negative belief, the world is dangerous, amplifies that. The emotion increases the dread, which then feeds the physical symptomology. So negative beliefs amplify emotions. And again, when we're trying to come back to, if you like, finding balance, one way in which we can find balance is begin to challenge some of the negative beliefs that we hold about ourselves. So how are we going to bring balance to the sympathetic nervous system? Well, we're going to acknowledge that thoughts and emotions don't have to be coupled together. That's a key one. We can uncouple thoughts and emotions. We can insert beliefs and begin to explore what our typical main first thought might be and the underpinning belief around ourselves through which we filter the thought, amplifying it towards very strong emotional responses, which then seem to reinforce the thought. So the emotion normally makes us believe that the thought we had is true. So if you think fear, well, you don't feel afraid, therefore you don't believe the fear. But if you feel fear, then the thought suddenly becomes real. And that's the significant things. If you watch a horror movie, you might see it, but it only is powerful if you begin to believe it, if the emotion appears. So when you feel fear, the thought suddenly is validated. This is a dangerous situation. And that's why challenging the thought and then challenging the belief can dissipate the emotion. And that's a really, really powerful thing. In my life, I'd say the uncoupling of the thought emotion matrix and an exploration of what I believe about myself has been one of the most powerful tools in beginning to find some emotional balance and step away from being a very reactive and defensive person. And we're going to close just in the next couple of minutes. I promised you an hour, and hopefully I've delivered nearly an hour. Just to highlight, next week we're going to be looking more specifically at issues around anxiety, and we're going to be exploring a few of those. But I wanted to offer this kind of framework tonight because I think this is really fundamental and will apply a lot of the kind of groundwork to the work that we do on worry and anxiety next week. But let's just have a look at my final slide, if you like, for tonight. And this is something I mentioned a little earlier on. This is the idea that actually our beliefs about ourselves aren't also set in stone. And as a Christian leader, I'm just so encouraged that the Bible, it doesn't contradict psychology. In fact, so much of the Bible is preeminent psychology. And our identity, the belief section of our responses to threats is really foundational. Here's some Bible verses just about our identity. I am created in God's image. That's something that challenges that belief that I'm worthless, that I will be abandoned. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. That sort of challenges that idea that I'm unlovable or that something's wrong with me. By grace, I am saved. It's a really one of the most powerful gifts in my life is the knowledge that actually I belong to God. Actually, God has saved me. I'm free from condemnation. So much of our emotional imbalance comes from feeling condemned, and I feel like believing or presuming the condemnation of other people. But actually, there's a gift here. I'm free from condemnation. I'm forgiven for all sins. It's amazing how shame and guilt have a really powerful fueling impact on our emotional imbalance. But knowing that you're forgiven from all the things that you've done wrong challenges that belief of I'm unlovable. And then I'm a new creation. What a fantastic promise. That's the one that undoes that idea that I'm not good enough or that I'm an outsider. And this is just a small number, just a tiny portion of the riches in the Bible in terms of understanding our identity. And that is a powerful gift because that, again, can undo and also settle some of our deep anxiety in immediate response to events which we find disquieting. Now, I know I've shared a lot tonight. I hope I haven't bored you. I hope I've given you a few helpful tools to think through, and that maybe in the context of group discussions now, or maybe even a time of prayer, or personally a time of prayer and meditation or breathing, I want to encourage you to kind of take some of these ideas forward. And then I look forward to coming back and meeting you again next week at the same time on the St. Dee's YouTube channel or on the Zoom group for members of the church. You can find out more, as I said, minerselffoundation.org, or you can, and hopefully I'll post these slides just at the beginning of next week, so you'll be able to download them and annotate them if that's helpful for you. God bless you. Have a great evening. I hope that you can, we'll talk about stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system a bit more next week, but remember the breathing exercise can do that. Do things that are good for you. Walk out in nature, be calm, take time for yourself. God bless, and we'll catch you after the weekend. Thanks so much, everyone.